And simultaneously with doing this, I also put together the Department of Housing and Community Development. So these were two things. So the idea was, if we've got a new program and new resources, we need to have a different delivery mechanism, a different organizational structure that consolidates all these different programs together under a new department. And so that's what we did to respond to this new formula allocation.
So the 7 categories, were they mostly place-based programs?
The categorical programs, they were a combination of both place-based and people programs. They were programs that provided resources for social services programs as well as they did for physical development. So a lot of category programs covered the whole range of needs in the community. The block grant program consolidated, you could do a whole range of, you could do everything. This is the most flexible tool, and it's still today the most sought after and program in the federal government is now funded at a range of about $4.6 billion a year that services over 1,000 communities. And the way that the program works is that a community that has a population over 50,000 people receives a formula allocation. For communities that have populations under $50,000, a formula allocation distributes those monies to the states, and the states makes those dollars available. So under the formula, 70% of the money goes to large entitlement, and 30% goes to these small communities through the state. So if you were in a community that had a population under 50,000, you would go to the states. States have flexibility to determine how they want to allocate it. They're not stuck to have to do a formula like you do with the larger communities. So large communities get over 50,000 get this through a formula allocation every year. And the amount of money is decreasing every year, because even though they may appropriate the same amount of money every year, the number of eligible communities is increasing. So it means the division of it gets to be smaller for every community. So right now in this formula that I talked about in the District of Columbia, the District of Columbia today, in the year 2007, their allocation, I think right now is about $16+ million, okay? So they have lost $6 million from where this formula whole harmless was into where they are today. But yet they're doing more programs and having more resources. At the same time that, I remember I mentioned to you earlier here that in 1968, we also saw the beginning of the Community Reinvestment Act. The implementation of it starts around 74, where we start saying, well, you all, the banks have to now begin to put money back into these neighborhoods, because what you see is a decreasing of funding coming into these communities from the federal government. And so in order to be able to do the redevelopment, we've got to push banks to become a major player with nonprofit organizations and with cities about putting resources that they were getting from depositories, people who were putting money into their banks back into the community. So you had a lot of national advocacy groups that came into place. They began to challenge that. ACORN was one of those organizations. You had another one called NCRC, who's an acronym I can't remember now. But they were another advocate. They began to really put a lot of pressure on banks about creating community reinvestment plans. A lot of banks began to hire community reinvestment officers. It was the first beginning of CDC being recognized with inside institutions. Now, a lot of banks took this because they were being forced from a regulatory standpoint to do this. But then they began to realize it was good business, that they could make money. It was not a portion of the bank that was going to have to depend upon the income from the other sectors, from the other commercial lending and real estate in order to balance out the books. They could do good, sound deals and get returns using community reinvestment. But this was a very important period of time, so now you have this behavior going on one side. So the Community Development Block Grant Program has driven the community development program since 1974, 75 until now. The 35th year almost of funding from this program. It's been the longest funded continuing block grant program in the country. But this is the way the work is being done in this field. Now, also what was happening in this period of time was that we began to see a number of things happening in communities. Urban renewal, neighborhood development program areas were struggling with not having enough resources to redevelop areas faster. These were areas that the private sector had no interest whatsoever. We couldn't give land away that was owned publicly to private developers to come into any of these areas to redevelop them. And it was only through through private sector investment in certain areas around the fringes of some of these areas. To give you an example, that in District of Columbia, that would have been Capitol Hill. They began to large, big, brownstone, beautiful homes that had been deteriorated. People started going and acquiring those, redeveloping those houses and whatnot. And so it began to start changing the investment climate in some of these areas. They could go to the city, they could go to Community Investment Act situations in the banks and get money and begin to redevelop it. So the private market forces began to create a reawakening of the opportunities in many of these distressed areas. And we are seeing that today. Today what we are seeing now in communities is this tremendous amount of private sector investment that's being done in these communities. The 14th Street urban renewal area, for example, which is one of the most devastated areas, it has an area called Columbia Heights. And up until, I would say up until almost the year 2000, 1998 to 2000, there was some public activity that was here. I mean, we were still using some of the federal programs to begin to redevelop some of these parcels, but it wasn't enough money to be able to do it at the same scale of land that was being owned by the public. And so what began to happen is that investments that were being made, for example, for transportation, new subway system was being put in. A major investment in capital investments that were being made in streets and sidewalks. So the physical infrastructure was beginning to be redeveloped. And so all of a sudden it takes on a new interest among the private sector. And this area now is an area where today the average price of housing in Columbia Heights is $500,000. Okay, so at $500,000, who in effect can live there? So in essence, we are the private forces of the market are displacing people the way we did on a volunteer basis through urban renewal. One of the programs that came along and in the late 80s came along was Hope 6. Now, what was interesting that we looked at the legislation about that, there was Hope 1, Hope 2, Hope 3, Hope 4, Hope 5, and Hope 6. A lot of hope. And they did different things. One was for rental housing, one was for new construction, for sale housing, for different things. But this is the one was targeted to distress public housing. That what was happening, and you remember when I told you that the formula that changed as a result of the Brooke Amendment, they began to change the level of income coming into public housing authorities and the operating subsidies that come to housing authorities through what's called an annual contributions contract that go to these authorities by the number of units that they have began to decrease. So when the money coming for operation decreases, what happens? It deteriorates. Because of the fact they don't have as much money to invest in the infrastructure of keeping the properties up. The same thing that happens to a private landowner who is not getting the same amount of resources to keep their properties up. So public housing began to deteriorate all across the country. And so the Hope 6 program was a way that says, we will give to communities that apply. Again, you're back to a competitive program. You compete with other authorities, and what we will do is, we will give you resources for you to remove targeted areas for public housing. And what you're supposed to create in this place are mixed income developments. So you're going to have a range from affordability to market rate housing in these new areas. They're being designated through Hope 6. Now, I had from a public policy standpoint, I had some angst with that. And I guess maybe because of my experience that I had going back in the first part of my career, that all the good intentions of public intervention sometimes doesn't mean the people who are going to be affected, those public housing residents, are going to have that first right to come back, or going to have the opportunity to come back into this new housing, because we still have not created a mechanism to track those families. Where do they leave, and where do they go to, and how do we get them back? And so that strategy concerns me. I'm saying all we're going to do is do the same thing we did under a new name, and it's going to be still a displacement strategy.